Well, greetings, guys. Welcome back to the much anticipated Lecture 6 for Unit 10 and also the final lecture of Unit 10. All right. So, just a reminder that this part of Unit 10 is sections 9.1 through 9.4 from your textbook, pages 236 through 257. All right. So, previously discussed in the topic of biodiversity, right? We've talked already this year about background extinction versus mass extinctions, right? So background extinction is just sort of an ongoing process. In nature, species come and species go. That is the story of Earth history, right? But if you guys do recall, there were 5 mass extinctions in Earth history in which there was a sudden and drastic drop-off in biodiversity, and usually that followed some sort of sudden and drastic change to the Earth system, right? And of course, one of the most famous ones was about 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous period that wiped out the dinosaurs. All right. Now, based on the current estimated rates of biodiversity loss, though, many conservation biologists are arguing that we are in the midst of a 6th mass extinction. And again, these are things we talked about previously. We also talked about the importance of biodiversity and maintaining it. Why do we rely on it? We rely on biodiversity for natural capital, right? So those ecosystem services like medicines and food and other resources, right? Making sure that we have cycling of nutrients, right? So we can maintain soil, making sure we have clean air and clean water and healthy watersheds, right? All those things, right? We have a heavy reliance on and interrelationships with maintaining a large degree of biodiversity, right? And also remember that an ecosystem is a system, right? In that there are lots of interworking parts. And if you disrupt one part of that system, right, there can be some fairly profound repercussions, right, damaging the rest of that ecosystem that maybe wouldn't be immediately apparent. All right? And we've also talked previously about the difference between a specialist species and a generalist species. Specialist species are highly adapted to specific habitats or specific conditions, whereas generalist species have adaptations that make them suitable for lots of different types of habitats and environments. All right? So keeping all those ideas in mind, we're going to build off those a little bit to talk specifically about endangered and threatened species, right? And what kind of characteristics we tend to see in those types of species, right? So quickly doing a differentiation between those two terms. An endangered species just simply means that we've labeled that species as highly vulnerable because there are so few individuals in that species that it could go extinct very soon without intervention. And I guess I am making an assumption that you guys understand that when we say a species is extinct, that means that there are no individuals left to repopulate that species, right? So endangered species mean that without some sort of intervention soon, they will likely go extinct and gone forever, right? Versus a threatened species, right? So these are sort of the types of species we'd put on watch and put maybe some sort of legal protection in, but they do have enough individuals to survive in the short term, but their populations are declining to the point where they might be labeled endangered soon. All right, so what we want to understand next is what sorts of characteristics do certain organisms have that make them more vulnerable than other species, right? And so we're going to list about 9, I think the magic number is 9 different characteristics here, and do a brief explanation as to how those come into play. All right, so for example, if the species has a low reproductive rate, right, that makes it very difficult if the population does get wiped out from a disease, for example. Not wiped out completely, but wiped out to the point that fewer individuals remain. Right? If there's a low reproductive rate, it makes it very difficult and it takes a very long time for that species to recover. So long gestation, so our K-selected species, right? So blue whales, elephants, pandas, right? A lot of our large mammals, right, have low reproductive rates. That's why a lot of our large mammals are vulnerable to becoming endangered or extinct. 2, having a highly specialized niche, right? Which means they're a specialist species, but in terms of what type of habitat or what type of food they have. So, for example, pandas, right, have a very specific diet, as do koalas, right? So pandas feed almost exclusively on bamboo. Koalas feed almost exclusively on eucalyptus trees, right? And therefore can only survive in certain habitats, and therefore have larger numbers to begin with, or smaller numbers to begin with, excuse me. Also similar to the idea of having a specialized niche in terms of diet, we also have specialized or narrow distribution. So like the elephant seal, for example, will only be found in relatively small, isolated areas, right? So because of that, they tend to support smaller populations. Being high on trophic levels. We talked about that 10% rule way back in September and October, right? But as you move up trophic levels, we're losing about 90% of the numbers, right? And so organisms that are on that 3rd or 4th trophic level, right, we cannot support very large numbers of those organisms, right? So smaller populations, generally more vulnerable to endangerment or extinction. Okay, fixed migration or specialized breeding habits. So probably the most relevant example for you guys is salmon, right? So salmon aren't entirely specialized in the sense that they can only survive in one specific habitat, but they do have very specialized migration grounds, right? So all salmon will return to their place of birth to spawn and reproduce, right? And so because of that, it makes them very difficult for them to reproduce in the case that their reproduction grounds are blocked by dams or something like that, right? Rare, right? So we do have some plant species that are exceptionally rare, and therefore very small populations. So like some types of orchids, for example, they're commercially valuable for example, their fur, like the snow leopard or tiger, or they have so medicinal, ancient, like Chinese medicine, for example, uses lots of animal parts in the medicines, right? Or tusks or hides or other parts that are found commercially valuable, right? They're prone to overhunting. Some species require a very large territory to support even a single individual, and therefore will have smaller populations as a result. Florida panthers, tigers, California condor are examples of that. And then, of course, we did talk about island biogeography theory earlier this year as well. So if the species is endemic to islands, remember, islands are smaller, support less biodiversity just by nature of them being islands, right? And so if they're only found on specific islands, populations are going to be smaller to begin with and are therefore more vulnerable to endangerment extinction because they don't have the option of migrating. All right. Now, all those characteristics in mind. So if we go back and look at any set or list of endangered species, almost all of them are going to have one or more of those characteristics listed. Now, what are the human behaviors, right? So again, background extinction happens, right? That's a part of Earth history. That's an ongoing, species come and go, right? What exactly is causing this huge increase in the rate of extinction so that many biologists would say that this is our 6th mass extinction? Well, there's certain things leading directly to that. The primary, single most important one probably is habitat destruction. Oh, I better hurry up, right? All right. So habitat destruction, single most common cause of species decline. Next would be invasive species, right? So there is in the textbook a little reading on invasive species, right? So invasive species are species that were natural to another ecosystem in another part of the world that have been introduced to ecosystems for which they have good adaptations to survive, right? The reason that's problematic, right, invasive species are problematic, is that the species in an ecosystem have not co-evolved with that invasive species, right? And therefore, maybe they've not developed over time and through coevolution defenses to a predator. They've not developed ways to compete with that invasive species if they are similar in terms of their niche. All right, and some really famous invasive species are cane toads, zebra mussels, and Burmese pythons. There'll be some resources posted to Classroom along with this lecture to help you guys learn a little bit more about those. Okay, next is overhunting and poaching, right? So particularly of our large mammal species, so tigers, rhinos, and elephants are probably the most common examples because there is some black market commercial value to those organisms. Pollution, right? So again, the probably the most relevant one at the moment is all the plastic pollution in the oceans. So stop buying single-use plastic bottles for water, you silly kids. And then, of course, climate change is going to become increasingly an issue as that changes habitats and ecosystems, and some organisms may struggle to cope with those changes. All right. Now, there are some important laws that the College Board would like you to know, right? And those laws are the Endangered Species Act, which was implemented in 1973, but of course has been updated several times since. And what it does is it creates a conservation plan, and in that plan, right, we have to protect habitats, entire ecosystems in which that endangered species is found, right? And it prevents any sort of development or actions that would jeopardize the habitat put aside for the protection of that species, right? Likewise, there is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, or which is the CITES, often referred to, and that's an international agreement. So this is the Endangered Species Act is a U.S. law, although many countries have a similar act in place for their own countries. The CITES agreement is an international agreement, which basically is to ensure that the international trade in specimens of our endangered species and wild species does not threaten their survival, right? So again, why you can't just, when it says adopt a tiger or adopt a snow leopard, that does not mean that you are literally going to bring a tiger or snow leopard home to live with you. It means you are providing funds to help with conservation efforts. All right. Now, speaking of conservation efforts, what if we do adopt a tiger or adopt a snow leopard, right, or donate to World Wildlife Fund or something like that? What sorts of things might that money go to? Well, often it goes to habitat restoration. So since habitat destruction is the #1 cause of species decline, it therefore makes sense that habitat restoration, right, to provide places for these organisms to live and thrive, would be what the most common form of conservation effort, right? Now, habitat restoration is what we call in situ or on-site conservation. So in situ conservation is setting aside parks or preserves. So remember we talked previously about wilderness areas versus national parks versus wildlife refuges, right? All of those are habitats set aside, right, that are conserved and protected to maintain some sort of natural function, and therefore, if that represents a habitat that an endangered species might be in, right, we have what we call on-site conservation. So we're protecting the species in their natural habitats. Okay? Now, contrast that with what we call ex situ or off-site conservation. So this is usually when we have a critically endangered species. So populations are so low that even if we set aside some habitat and protect those species, they're not likely to survive on their own. The population is just too low. They're not likely to recover, right? And so the way we do off-site conservation is like zoos and aquariums, where they maintain like captive breeding programs, right? So they might bring a male and a female together for the sole purpose of breeding some offspring to slowly start building numbers again, right? Now, another type of ex situ conservation, which is not necessarily limited to our extremely endangered species, but for our plant species, is we have what are called seed banks. A lot of plant seeds can be stored for extended periods of time, as long as it's kept cool and dry, right? In which if if we have a large forest fire, for example, that might wipe out the last existing of a population of a species, right, of plants, we would therefore have seeds, backups that could be germinated and planted to help repopulate that particular species, right? Now, it is worth saying that it only works for some types of seeds, so like avocado seeds, for example, although avocados obviously are not endangered, but their seeds are not able to be stored, right? They basically have to be dropped and germinated right away. So not all plant species have seeds that can be stored long term, right? It is worthwhile pointing out that maybe some of you guys like the idea of working, or finding a career in the world of conservation efforts for biodiversity. That would make you somebody that might be interested in working in the field of conservation biology, right? There are people that study ecosystems and habitats, or even all the way down to specific species, what they need and require to survive and thrive, and therefore would have some important input on how to best go about replenishing the populations of those endangered species. All right. We're almost to the 17-minute mark, all right? I hope everything's going okay at home, and we will talk to you soon.